I don't watch the news, and for me that has political and also intellectual reasons. I would like to talk to you about these reasons today. First of all, how did I come to this myself? My beginnings of distancing myself from news began with Qigong. The masters taught us that we should pay attention to our feelings when we watch television, for example, or look at pictures in newspapers, because our teachers had already taught us that we can control our autonomic nervous system through images. This is how we learn to distinguish healing images from destructive, toxic images. They gave us the tip that if we look at violent images, we should at least carry out a healing exercise with healing images on ourselves afterwards. From there, my resume in television began. Crime. At least half an hour of practice afterwards. News when topics came up that particularly frightened me, such as plane crashes or something to do with war. Then I had to practice for a particularly long time. Increasingly, news seemed inefficient to me. Why would I watch something that I had to practice so much afterwards? This then expanded to include crime stories, and increasingly to pictures in newspapers. I noticed that there were increasingly violent, frightening images, and I restricted my consumption more and more. For about 10 years, I have lived completely without a television, without a radio, without a theater or a cinema, and it healed my intelligence and emotions tremendously. What do I do instead to anticipate this? I specifically read a lot of good books, and I remember the content very well. My coming out, now also on YouTube, that I don't watch any news. I was encouraged to come out by Rolf Dobelli. He is a Swiss journalist, and wrote a detailed article in 2012 about why he no longer watches the news, even as a journalist. I like this article so much that I would like to share its basic ideas with you. Maybe if you've already thought about whether you want to give yourself a daily dose of news from the radio, TV, or the internet in the future, maybe I'll encourage you to follow a news diet. The journalist Rolf Dobelli describes news as fast food or, in his German, short food. Dobelli compares news to what sugar or keiki is to food. He compares it to this, right down to its harmfulness. News destroys your ability to concentrate. News also destroys understanding of what is really happening in the world. His motto is, news is to the mind what sugar is to the body. He says we are so well informed and yet know so little. News, he says, is appetizing, easy to digest, and at the same time extremely harmful. The media feeds us little morsels of trivial stories, and saturation never occurs like with cake. News is sugar bombs for the mind. As with cake, the side effects only become apparent later. Dobelli confesses himself, I have been living completely without news for 2 years and can see, feel, and describe firsthand the effects of this freedom, clearer thinking, more valuable insights, better decisions, and more time. He then presents 12 arguments for why we should all adopt a news diet, or even a complete abstinence from news. His first argument is that news leads to a false risk map in the mind, so they cause exactly the opposite. We want to protect ourselves from certain things and therefore be informed, but yes, they lead us to a misjudgment of the situation. Why is this? This has to do with news as a commodity. The media knows that it is very difficult for them to sell the abstract, the complex, the subtle, the invisible. So focus on exactly the opposite, the small, the simplified, the surface, the visible. And so it happens that we give each other gripping stories, screaming images, and sensational short facts. Our body, our brain, reacts exactly to this. That's what they want, our attention, and that's exactly what our brain does. Dobelli also says that it reacts disproportionately strongly to visible, scandalous, sensational, shocking, personal, loud, striking, rapidly changing and colorful stimuli. Then we see what news has in common with advertising. Accordingly, the subtle, complex, profound, and abstract are systematically hidden. but it is precisely the background that would be important for us if we actually want to understand something about what is being reported. Dobelli gives the example of a collapsed bridge and crushed cars and some survivors. What will the news make of it? They'll focus on the squished cars. This is the visible, the superficial. If there are survivors, they will seek out a person who survived the whole thing and is now interviewable. The car looks wonderfully hideous. The person is ideal for a gripping story. On top of that, you save yourself research and you can produce a message quickly and cheaply. What, on the other hand, would be important? What remains hidden in this car and bridge story? The question is, why did the bridge collapse in the first place? When assessing risk, it would also be important to ask whether there are similar bridges that are designed to be similarly risky. News consumers are weighing the risks very incorrectly. Dobelli listed on terrorism is overrated, chronic stress is underestimated. For those who are wondering, I'll add the chronic stress. Doctors now say that around 70% of chronic illnesses that lead to death are stress-related. More people now die from stress than from car accidents. The bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers is overestimated. Fiscal irresponsibility is underestimated. Britney Spears is overrated. The results of atmospheric research are underestimated. Astronauts are overrated. Nurses are underestimated. Plane crashes are overestimated. Antibiotic resistance is underestimated. Anyone who watches the news is largely misinformed. He has the wrong risk map in his head. His sense of reality differs starkly from what is really real. And this false sense of reality then leads to wrong behavior. The risks, says Dobelli, that you read about in the press are not the real risks. Now you could say, yes, well, you only consume news wisely. They ignore the gripping stories and concentrate on what is real. There have been tests here too, and Dobelli says even bankers and economists who have a real interest in being well informed have shown themselves to be uninformed because of the news. The only solution is to completely isolate themselves from the news stream. The second point Dobelli makes is news is irrelevant. News is meaningless. He thinks we will have devoured around 10,000 short messages in the last 12 months. And that's roughly 30 reports per day, and he suggests the following test. Name the news items from the last 12 months that were truly significant in your life, for their job, for their career, for their leisure decisions. How would your life have been different if you hadn't had this news? Dobelli says no one he asked could name more than 2 news stories about it. And he gives the example from his own life. He went to the airport once. That was when the Icelandic volcano exploded and air traffic was largely stopped, and went to the airport for free because the planes didn't take off. However, if he had properly given his telephone number to the airport would have called him directly. It sometimes happens to me that I don't know when Deutsche Bahn will play a trick again and not let trains run. Instead of watching the news, I tend to ask friends or go online to see if the trains are running. So I get targeted information and don't have to depend on the news program to do so. Dobelli's conclusion is that news is unimportant for what really matters in life. They're entertaining but useless. And he asks, how much junk does her brain have to digest to get to this gem of 1 or 2 important messages? If you now reply, the news is about earth-shattering things, and he looks back at the outbreak of the First World War. It was about the assassination attempt on the heir to the Austrian throne in Sarajevo. The journalists had completely misjudged this attack. The murder in Sarajevo was just one of many reports in 1914, and no journalist had clearly assigned the relevance of this assassination attempt and its consequences. Accordingly, with the introduction of the first internet browser in 1993, the internet has changed our world. This internet browser mosaic was hardly worth reporting. The same applies to the invention of the atomic bomb. The really important facts only become clear in retrospect. And in general, Do you want to leave this selection to a group of journalists about what is important in the sea of reports? The default selection of news depends on the level of attention you hope to get from it. Someone is swallowed up, for example, 78 citizens shot in 1 hour, and of course disasters from all over the world. Someone once called this American news channel continuous negative news as an abbreviation for CNN. Continuous bad news. Perhaps they continue to object to news being irrelevant because they believe being informed gives them a competitive advantage. Dobelli counters this brilliantly. It will give them a competitive advantage if they are focused, if they have background knowledge. Bits of news will, under no circumstances, give them a competitive advantage. Their friends, their colleagues, will tell them what's really important. And Dobelli says that the beauty of being informed via social networks is great. You get what's really important through the social filter. If you want to have a competitive advantage, or want to be informed, read background reports. Read the books that actually interest you thematically and that you want to enjoy reading. Dobelli's third argument is that news doesn't inform you, but it also limits your understanding of the matter. In news, they are fed with light material, with anecdotes, with scandals, with popular stories and pictures. Anything that is cheap to produce and can be quickly digested in small bites. But they don't need a superficial view to understand the world. Car crumpled on bridge, but they need the background information. Why do bridges collapse? Which ones are built similarly? Dobelli's fourth argument is that news even poisons her body. And I also share this argument of his. News keeps the part of our nervous system that wants to protect us from danger on its toes. They cause us constant stress. Any disturbing story, even if you mentally think you can filter it out or block it out, any disturbing story leads to cortisol release. Cortisol then enters the bloodstream, weakening your immune system, making you more susceptible to flu and other illnesses, and reducing the release of growth hormones. This means that when you consume news on television or radio or newspapers, your body is in a constant state of stress. In Dobelli's words, news consumers are putting their physical health at risk. And not only that, other potential side effects include anxiety, aggressiveness, tunnel vision, and emotional insensitivity. Dobelli's 5. The argument against news reinforces systematic errors in thinking. The background on which he argues is as follows. Our brain longs for stories that make sense. And so people fall for simplifications very quickly. Dobelli quotes this wonderful simplification from his high school history book. For example, why did the French Revolution happen? 3 reasons are given in the book. This is of course a huge reduction in complexity. News beats it all. Let's take the example of the stock market crashing. While experts are still puzzling over how this could have happened and weighing theories against each other, journalists pick out a superficial reason and the story is ready. The stock market crashed because the story is finished. The reality is exactly the opposite. It is complex and many factors come into play. For example, we don't really know why a war broke out, who the wires are here, or why the price of silver goes up or down. The journalist simply writes that the market developed this way because the company went bankrupt, because anyone who falls for it is a fool. To a large extent, says Dobelli, himself a journalist. As I said, to a large extent, news reports consist solely of stories and anecdotes that are sold as coherent analyses. Even more radical is Dobelli's point 6. News inhibits that thinking. Dobelli says thinking requires concentration. Concentration needs undisturbed time. If you open yourself up to the stream of pseudo-facts, your ability to concentrate will be lost. In point 7, Dobelli becomes even more radical. He says news changes the structure of your brain towards multitasking. As I now assume, Neuroplasticity means that our brain reacts fairly quickly to the impressions in its surroundings. This is how the brain naturally reacts to this tidbit of news, this constant bombardment of short attention-drawing stories. This causes the very circuits that are unnecessary for deep thinking to atrophy. Dobelli believes that most news consumers no longer have the ability to read longer articles or books. After 4 or 5 pages, they get tired, their attention dwindles, and they become restless. This is not due to the fact that people are getting older, but rather these tidbits of news are making them increasingly unable to concentrate or even debilitated. On the other hand, neuroplasticity also means that if you want to regain the ability to concentrate, says Dobelli, if you immerse yourself in a topic, there is no way around a news-free mental diet. Listening takes about a year of abstinence from news until it regains the structure to read longer texts without tiring. So at least a year of recovery time for the brain. Point 8 news is a waste of time. And in this respect, they even cause huge economic costs. First, time is lost watching the news. Secondly, by refocusing, when you want to focus back on what you were previously dealing with. And thirdly, of course, through the after effects of news. I personally know stories where people tell me that they sometimes even have trouble sleeping because of the news. Dobelli calculates as follows. If you read the newspaper in the morning, listen to the headlines on the radio for 15 minutes at lunchtime, and watch the daily news in the evening, you have wasted valuable time. If you add a bit of online news during work, 5 minutes of information gathering, KIE and DA, and the time spent refocusing, you quickly get to an hour per day. Over the course of a week, you will lose between half a day and a full day. Why are you doing this to yourself? Even if it may not sound like a synopsis, take the example of the terrorist attacks in Mumbai in 2008. Terrorists killed 200 people in an act of self-importance. Dobelli says, imagine that 1 billion people devoted an average of 1 hour of their attention to the tragedy in Mumbai. In purely temporal terms, 2,000 human lives were destroyed through news consumption, Dobelli believes, 10 times more than those who died in the assassination attempt. Attention is a scarce resource. Information is booming at us in abundance. Conserve your scarce resource. Point 9 at Dobelli, news undermines the connection between fame and achievement. In my words, reputation and performance. In a small social group, it is important to know who can do what and who can I turn to. We depend on supplements. And when we still have face-to-face contact, we quickly sense whether someone can do something. Television, on the other hand, builds up individual personalities as stars or super experts, and we can't really assess it. The signal, hello, he deserves attention, often does not correspond at all to criteria that are important for our lives. R. A key term in the news is the word celebrity. Above all, stay away from people who appear to you to be celebrities. Point 10. Why is news unimportant? Dobelli says precisely because they are fabricated by journalists. In his assessment as a professional, he says less than 10% of news stories are actually written by a single journalist. Less than 1% is actually based on verified facts. Less than 1%. Many reporters write their reports based on reports, texts, other journalists, or quick internet research. Point 11. Reported facts are sometimes wrong. Predictions from news are almost always wrong. Every day the news also serves us interviews with supposed experts who then deliver their predictions quickly after an event. There is now a Berkeley professor, Philip Tedlock. This Berkeley professor has studied such news forecasts over a decade. Then they entered. He evaluated 82,361 predictions. His result was that the predictions could just as easily have been coincidences. The expert forecasts, as traded on television that received the most media attention, were particularly unreliable. My personal favorite example comes from my childhood. Then I was impressed in the next period, I think, when so-called television experts now brought dry ice bars with them to the Nachrichten studio. At that time, the theory was that the experts had predicted that global cooling experts had really made the viewers know that the sun would be theirs. Activity is increasingly ceasing, and we are heading towards a new ice age. Accordingly, you can imagine how I trust experts on global warming. And where does my skepticism come from? That I don't watch TV, but that I have direct contact with scientists. Here in Kiel, for example, there is the Geoma Institute. I also have contact with volcanologists who say that the greenhouse effect is so small in percentage terms compared to the climate change caused by, for example, a single volcanic eruption. In the top 3, real experts point out that, for example, there was a radical increase in temperature in the Middle Ages, but it was not caused by technology. So there have always been major climate fluctuations, but that's my opinion, based on actual discussions with experts. They are steered in a certain direction by messages. Dobelli himself, back to him, asks, did the newspapers predict the First World War? So everything on the subject of forecasts. What is really important? Did the newspapers predict the Great Depression or the sexual revolution? Did the newspapers predict the collapse of the Soviet Union, the rise of the internet, resistance to antibiotics, or the explosive increase in depression? These so-called television experts, or news, did not predict everything that really defines and radically changes life. News manipulates us. As long as we are in personal contact, in direct contact with people, we react on a variety of levels when a person lies to us or wants to manipulate us. Voice, accident, pauses, eye contact, body odor, gestures. All of this is filtered out very well in television news and media news. Often the criterion is that what is said the most must be true, right? When we lived in small groups of people, we almost always knew the messenger's background. Information came with an unparalleled set of metadata. Nowadays, Dobelli knows the news business. Companies, interest groups, and other organizations spend gigantic sums on public relations. To influence us, of course. They wouldn't put so much money into it if it didn't work. The news story in the run-up to the Gulf War in 1991 is pretty stark. That's when the news broke the story of the nurse Nayera. Nayera was a 15-year-old Kuwaiti woman. She testified before the American Congress in the run-up to the Gulf War. She claimed she saw Iraqi soldiers killing infants at a hospital in Kuwait. My comment. You will notice that this is precisely why I am extremely skeptical about highly emotional news. The result for Dobelli was that almost every medium continued to spread this highly emotional story. The American audience in particular was beside itself. The media had now reached here. The story helped get Congress to approve the war against Iraq. Nayera's testimony, which at the time was considered credible by all media, radio, television, and newspapers, was later exposed as war propaganda that had been planned for a long time. Journalists want one thing above all: to present them with a very specific picture of the world in order to guide their willingness to act in a certain direction. News makes them depressed. In Dobelli's language, news makes us passive. Why? For the most part, they deal with things that they cannot influence at all. There's nothing you can do. And the daily repetition of things that they cannot influence infantilizes them. They feel powerless. They feel at the mercy. They have a feeling of loss of control. The result is a fatalistic worldview and a pessimistic self-assessment, even self-doubt. Psychologically, they are forced into a victim role by this type of news. The scientific term for this depression role is learned helplessness, according to Martin Seligman. From Dobelli's point of view, news consumption plays a major role in the simultaneous spread of depression. He says that, in any case, the spread of depression coincides precisely with the growth and flourishing of the mass media and its news. Point 14. News kills your creativity, your creative power. That's exactly what defines her as a person. They live here to shape the world, to shape it in their unique direction. According to Dobelli, pseudo-knowledge limits our creativity. This is one of the reasons why mathematicians, writers, composers, and entrepreneurs usually produce their most creative achievements at a young age. My comment, you notice that a very important rejuvenation factor for you now lies in hearing, but also in the way you live your life. I don't know a single creative mind who is a news junkie. Not a writer, not a composer, not a mathematician, not a physicist, not a scientist, not a musician, not a designer, not an architect or painter. The creativity-destroying effect of news may also have something to do with a very simple fact: concentration. Anyone who is distracted by news, whose attention is constantly fragmented, cannot generate new ideas. For people who are church-minded, point 15 may still be important. News gives us the illusion of compassion. Many say we are global citizens. We have to be informed. For ethical reasons, I have to watch the news. Just watching people being dragged out from under the rubble of their homes after a storm. Is that compassion? Does it prompt a meditation for the victims? Afterwards, do they even have the strength to concentrate on praying for such victims? Dobelli says real participation is not a warm, fuzzy feeling in the sense of I was there, I'm informed, but real participation is action. Getting excited about your own compassion by watching Haitian earthquake victims crawling out of the rubble on the daily news is simply disgusting. If I have now convinced you to take a closer look at what you are doing to yourself with this news consumption, then you might ask yourself, how can I reorganize my everyday life? For me, it's not about simply offering them interesting ideas, a basis for discussion, or triggering an intense feeling, but my goal is actually always to take action. Dobelli advises deleting the news apps on your iPhone, selling your television, and not reaching for newspapers and magazines lying around in airports or even on trains. To avoid the news junkie mood, read a summary in The Economist, for example, but don't spend more than 5 minutes on it per week. And there is no way around it. The world is highly interpretable and highly complex. Exactly which factors produced what remains, at least from a scientific point of view, always controversial and always open. Even the scientific hypothesis that is shared today may be the wrong one in 10 years, even from the expert's point of view. We quickly notice this when we have studied how quickly certain beliefs are overthrown from a scientific perspective within 10 or at the latest 15 years. Do you mean news that singles out one factor that is meaningful? In my opinion, there is no getting around it if you actually want to be informed. Read books. I have also drastically reduced my book consumption because I no longer read what I need to read, but I still love non-fiction books. And that is a beautiful life, because what I'm reading now has a resonance space. And otherwise it's actually fun to talk directly to people who we personally consider to be experts. Even the most amazing experts live in our neighborhood. And what they say from their personal perspective, unfiltered, uncensored, is really exciting. And above all, they get to know nice people.